Think about the first person that said the world was round. I think they killed him, right? I think they killed him. Today's one of my favorite topics. It's the label of being stupid. Kids are labeled LD, learning disability. They're on IEPs, or one of our favorites, ADHD. So many times we force these labels on our youth, on ourself, and don't take accountability. Once you embrace who you are, all the other stuff fades away. You're not stupid. We're not stupid. We're not ADHD. We're not this. Welcome to Beyond the Label podcast. My name is Jacob Spellis, and today's one of my favorite topics. It's the label of being stupid, and I think about how many kids are labeled LD, learning disability. They're on IEPs, or one of our favorites, ADHD, ADHD. And so many times we force these labels on our youth, on ourself, and don't take accountability. When I think about my life, I think about I wasn't not intelligent. I was just misunderstood, And a lot of times when the way we bring information to kids, it's just different. We don't understand how trauma affects the brain, or how generations of trauma or generational learning habits, or, just things we see transpire into a kid's life, even the food they eat, even this. But the bottom line, I'm speaking to the kids, the adults, the people that are called stupid, how misunderstood we were, and how to treat yourself. Because a lot of times it's not that we're not paying attention or we're not interested. It's just not interesting to us to get like a dopamine rush to understand what's going on. So in my world, as an entrepreneur, ADHD is a kryptonite, but it's my biggest blessing that I have. Like, I can go from running this department to working on this project to having 20 browsers opens to going. And I remember early in my career, I couldn't contain myself, and it would be in meetings, and the big boss and the CEO would be like, "Jake, what?" And I'm like, "Oh, nothing. I'm just going with ideas. And now I feel like I get paid for the ideas, I'm in a spot that I'm comfortable, as a CEO, where my ADHD, entrepreneurship to me is the key, because projects never end. When you have a business, you are never done. If I work at a factory, I would imagine it would be like, I did work at a factory. Actually, I had to staple these pallets together with boxes, and they'd fill the boxes. The goal was maybe, fill up 100 units or something, or package out this many pallets. It would start here and here. But in entrepreneurship, the end never stops. Think about, we're getting to a time now where it seems crazy, but there's trillion-dollar companies, I think social media has made it rough on people, because you used to just have to have a good job, and then you had to make 6 figures, and now 7 figures, and now I seen something the other day, in public, there was like I guess it must have been a lottery that was real big, and I don't know what it was, maybe $500 million, which is insane, $500 million. And they're like, yeah, but you would have to pay the taxes on that. And I'm thinking like, damn, that's a terrible problem to have. Like, what kind of silly stuff is that, But when we think about the complexity of the God's given gift, people have children, and maybe yourself, that label of ADHD or learning disability. It's a gift and a curse, but focusing on that gift, labeling kids certain ways, shouldn't be labeling them, put them in other rooms and never talk about them again. We should have gifts to help the children, right? A lot of studies, the boys will not catch up to the girls maturity-wise and stuff to their 3rd grade. So a lot of the education provided is not tailored, I would say, helping people on skilled trade. We know We know the epidemic with college degrees and what happened, and so many loans, no job, no skill set really. But, are we training people to be in the skilled trade, plumbers, working with your hands, which build the world, Are we giving kids that are so advanced? I think the problem is that, kids that are underperforming, right? Like if this was the average, right? We have kids that are underperforming test score wise, behavior wise, maybe or something. Our goal is to get them to the middle, right? But then we have kids that are excelling, and our goal is actually still really to get them to the middle. We don't work on these kids that are up here and take them up here. We just, what we need for the learn, the hours, in my opinion, kids with ADHD, are we tailoring what they want to learn? I've studied other countries, and a lot of times they would pick a career based on some of their talents early on, and they would study that, right? Like at high school sports, there's some sports where, you can't just play football, baseball, wrestling, basketball, whatever. You pick one sport and you excel at that. So same thing with people with ADHD, getting on the same track to not have a learning disability, but just being misunderstood, right? So if you love math, what are we doing? The kid, I was one of these kids, fill out the test real quick, and then they're like, well, during your IOP, you need 2 hours of testing. But it's like, shit, I'm getting them done in 10 minutes, I see the same thing with my son, he'll rattle off tests and nothing. I got no homework ever, but he skips little details and stuff. But are we challenging kids to really go after that? I see like colleges and schools, sometimes we're teaching stuff that is so behind. We look at like AI and, I remember growing up always like, you won't have a calculator on you at all times. And we do, like we could, hey Siri, what's 4 times 4, but, we punish kids in a certain way, Not saying I have the best ways to fix the system or anything, but just some challenging questions. But also carrying that label is, how do I think outside the box to be successful? I always think about the saying, never break the laws, but we can break the rules, right? When we set the standard because of our stuff, if our gift is working on many projects, would I make an excellent project manager, having ADHD, would I be able to make the next Wikipedia because I got all these facts and I'm fluid and I'm intelligent, and I'm putting everything together, challenge yourself. It's not a thing of procrastination or anything like that. It's how do I implement my maybe quote weakness and make it a strong point in my life. Growing up, I had dyslexia, and I remember one of the gifts I got was able to present, even today I run meetings and I don't know how to spell the best words, but I'm man enough to admit I don't know a word and don't say the right stuff at the same time, but it forced me to have to present well because I couldn't read the material, but I could get up and talk in front of everybody like I did. So I would be that kid, show up to class, hey, do we have a test today? Oh, yeah. I was like, shit, I don't even have a pencil. Can I borrow a pencil? We have to present in front of the class. I would ask my part, hey, what was the book about? It was about, I've never read any of those books, Romeo and Juliet. Like, I feel like sometimes my friends will make jokes about books we read, and I'm too embarrassed to admit, like, I didn't read any of that stuff, but I would get a glimpse and be able to present a whole topic, which later helped me speaking, which running groups, running meetings, setting the standard there, talking in front of a lot of people. Sometimes I'm like, I'm never prepared, but I'm always ready, So ADHD has helped me deal with a lot of that type of stuff, and I want you guys who's reading the podcast, maybe you can comment below some of the stuff that you were faced with or you were challenged with as a kid that became your blessing, that you became beyond the label of people that gave you, and I think a lot of times, even athletes and get a bad rep and stuff like this, but a lot of that stuff, school would say like, oh, they're obsessive, they're this, they got compulsive disorder, but I think being compulsive can be a really good thing. Like if you take a topic that you're so passionate about and you build an entire business about it, right? You build out the research, you do the blogs, you know the statistics, you provide ways to help, you know, that obsession is great. You know, when you think about Chick-fil-A, you know, they just sell nuggets and shit, you know, but they're obsessed with customer service. You're like, man, I didn't think, you know, I go to some other places, you know, and you're like, this is terrible, but you expect it. Then you go to another place and the customer service there, they became freaks and obsessed with customer service, you know. So think about some topics in your life to become obsessive. You know, I think it's so good if I'm an athlete, you know, I'm studying, you know, I remember I went to a conference and Tom Brady spoke there, and this dude was obsessed with his body, you know, as a temple, you know, and I think the dude wouldn't eat tomatoes and, you know, would have one strawberry a week or some shit, you know, or one piece of dark chocolate, you know, and man, you see the obsessiveness. And imagine those athletes, you know, they're studying films, they're studying legends, they're constantly outworking somebody. And that's, you know, to the outside world, they'd be like, man, I can't do all that stuff. I can't work. But to the individuals that might have ADHD, that's our blessing, you know, that's our blessing. Never ever feel uncomfortable in a world where, you know, you have to be like this. Always be comfortable with the true person you are, you know. Obviously, you got to learn coping skills, you know, how not to interrupt people, be rude, making impulse decisions, or maybe your anger's off the wall or something like that. That can be negative. But in a positive exercise, how is this your kryptonite where you want to go? You know, I work with a lot of individuals, you know, that might have bipolar disorder. And one of the challenging things that they always have is once they get stable is they miss those manic episodes for a little bit because they're creative. They can work, you know, they can do better things. They can work with 1 hour of sleep for a whole week, you know, like those are the things they kind of miss. But that leads to hospitalization. That could lead to really bad stuff. That can lead to being paranoid. But you know, I think about how do we use what we think is a curse and turn into our biggest blessing, you know? And the most successful people are the ones that got accelerated on what they really like, their passion, what they're good at, their strengths, you know, and became locked in, you know. There's a book Sam Walton has, the owner of Walmart, and he was obsessed with other grocery stores. And I think in the book he was arrested in Brazil or somewhere like that. And he was arrested because he was measuring the length of the grocery, like the aisles, you know, and he got arrested. And what he, you know, was reported that he was like, I wanted to know what they didn't know I knew about the other grocery stores. Like, that's obsessive, you know. And there's another story in the book where they, some new people, up and comers, were reaching out to all the biggest grocery store chain owners, and they just want some guidance or something like that. And they reached out to maybe 20 people, and, you know, Sam Walton was the only person to respond to that. And he interviewed these people, and, you know, he took notes and showed up and picked them up. And, you know, they were kind of like, wow, the biggest person. He's like, you know, and he's like, I wanted to see if they knew something I didn't know. So even at that huge level, they're still in the game. They're still learning. They're obsessed. They're ready to go, you know. And I think about these labels that we carry on, that we called ourselves stupid, you know. But a lot of times, you guys have done it where you talk to actual stupidity, you know, and you just kind of keep it to yourself. You know what that is. But you have to believe that label first. They're just labeled. Like I tell people, you know, even in counseling sessions, you know, you're not ADHD, you're not bipolar, you know, no other health condition does that shit. Like nobody walks around like, you know, hey, I'm swine flu, you know, no, I happen to have swine flu, you know, hey, I'm this. No. You're a person who had that diagnosis, right? You're not bipolar, you're not ADHD. I'm Jake, and I happen to have these diagnoses. We don't take those labels to heart. You know, we use them in a giving way to help other people and stuff, So even, my mom said this to me one time, I was like, I don't know why I had dyslexia and all this stuff, and then my daughter, I could spot it right away before she even started kindergarten. She's like, well, maybe that was your reason. And I was like, well, that's a lot of torture, just early, whatever, but, I was able to spot that out in kids. And even I see the youth in our program and, I won't say it, to them. I'm like, yeah, that shit's stupid. You don't even have to, I didn't take any OGTs, ACTs, and I turned out successful. But, I can't tell my kids that because then they'll probably stop going to school or something. But, we think about, how do we take ourselves to the next level? And it's always reducing the label and the barrier that we have on ourselves. How many times have you said something, right? On average, like 2/3 of our thoughts can be negative daily, where we said something and then we put the label on ourselves before even achieving it. Like, yeah, I'm just not organized, I'm just not there. Or we see somebody who's successful and then we immediately go to victim mode. Like, yeah, they had it easy, and I'm like, what? Like I had people in my company, especially the recovery community, they're always like, yeah, I've been through this. And they tell war stories and stuff. And, they're cool, but it's, they think of other people in our company like, well, they didn't go through that. And it's like, you don't even know their life story. They had it actually way worse than you. They just didn't put drugs in their body, So when we think about going to that next level, what are the labels that you have, that you instill in yourself that are stopping you, that are completely stopping you? I've interviewed people, and you can see in the podcast and other episodes, people that had very severe labels, but it became to their advantage, and I think once you embrace who you are, all the other stuff fades away. You're not stupid. You're just gifted and misunderstood. Think about the first person that said the world was round. I think they killed him, right? I think they killed him, so don't get killed. But, think about, what's some stuff that idea is so crazy, that eventually they'll come around and say, I knew you could do it. It's like, no, you didn't. You said on Facebook, it's a stupid idea. It's proof. But again, it's not their dream. It's your dream. It's not, to convince everybody. You got to convince yourself first, and we got to remove those labels. Don't tell yourself all the reasons you could fail. Tell your reasons. What happened if you actually succeed? A lot of people don't do that. In their plans. They're like, man, what if I fail and lose all my money? Yeah, but what if you actually make it and change your entire generation because you remove the label on yourself, And now you can teach the kids, like now I can teach my kids how to manage. My daughter went to school with me in therapy school. There's many times she's at, University of Toledo, University of Michigan with me, and I have her on my lap. I remember when she was born, she was only a couple of days old, and I could never afford a laptop in college, so I would just keep her on my leg and type papers and stuff like that. Then she would go to school. Even now, my daughter was young, and she would have a problem with somebody. She would email her counselor, like 5th, 6th grade, and talk about the coping skills and stuff. And I was like, I'm sorry, she grew up with me at social work school, but maybe that's the reason you're moving forward to help people and really have purpose. When we think about what life did to us, we can never see what it did for us. It's a powerful thing to think about, and you see it all the time. We think about, maybe kid, you didn't grow up without a father. I can't imagine that sucks. You go outside and you're waiting for a man to pick you up and guide you, and, he's never there, but I've seen some people that like, thank God I didn't have a father in my life. I think about the times, even had problems at home and had to live on my own, but it made me a man. It made me who I am. When all kids were in their senior year of high school, going to prom, playing football, I was literally incarcerated that whole time. I didn't get any of those experiences. I never got to do that. But, while other kids were graduating, going to prom, thinking about college, I was facing 10 years in prison where I got to actually do that. And in that time, I found out I had these mental health diagnoses, and I found out I had learning disabilities, and the teachers there, I think his name was Mr. Brown, I think, and he played for the Cleveland Browns. Very tough guy, gold bracelet. He had like one of them tough ass, what's it called, the mustache, that handlebar mustache. You think it's a joke, but he would scary man, And then there's another lady. This is bad, but I remember forever. They would teach us the GED material in like criminal language. So some of you criminals, it's like, what's an ounce of weed? 28 grams. What's a pound? 16 ounce, right? They would break down stuff we knew into language we understood. So geometry, what are the gangs over here? I remember, and they're like, this street is this street, and this street is this street, and really helped us, So they saw the genius in us. We just applied it to different places, and that's what always hurts me the most, being in these jails and prisons and seeing the best athletes, tattoo artists, entrepreneurs, just really smart people, but we just gave it away because you fed into that label that you will always be this, So as we move forward, 2026, think about the labels. You can comment below, but think about the labels you want to remove that you had on yourself, we always say the kid that was supposed to never be shit runs the biggest business in the town, or, the smallest guy becomes the biggest athlete. We're not going into 2026 listening to this, We're not stupid, we're not ADHD, we're not this, we're people with purpose and mission, remember that. So thank you for tuning in today. Beyond the Label podcast out on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, probably some other places and stuff. Just do us a favor, send us a download, a review, or even let us know, hey, this is a stupid episode. We'll take it. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure being with everybody.